Language of Diversity series, and we are celebrating Black History Month with our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Marvin Whitfield. So it is my pleasure to introduce him this evening. Dr. Whitfield is the CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Northwestern Ohio, and he's the founder of the Blue Force Mobile Training Team. Before moving to the private and nonprofit sector, Dr. Whitfield served as a team leader and senior instructor on a Department of Defense contract and conducted numerous training missions for the United States Army Intelligence Center of Excellence Training Division. Dr. Whitfield's previous work experience also includes more than 2 decades of law enforcement, where he retired as a police commander. Dr. Whitfield's educational background consists of a Doctor of Philosophy in Criminal Justice, a master's degree in Criminal Justice Administration, and a Master of Business Administration. He specializing in human resource management and holds a certification in psychology of leadership. Dr. Whitfield serves his community as a Rotarian, a member of the Perrysburg Coalition for Inclusion and Social Justice, and a special deputy with the Wood County Sheriff's Office. He sits on several committees whose mission centers around promoting social equality and youth resilience. Dr. Whitfield, it is such an honor to have you with us this evening. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you for humbling the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Implicit Bias in Healthcare, Mitigating the Impact. And like Dr. Thomas stated, it's more of a discussion. I encourage you to enter any questions you have in the chat box as we proceed through the presentation, but also if you want to wait to the back end, we will open the floor for a Q&A on the back end of the presentation. So let's start the introduction process. I've done extensive research in the area of implicit bias and impact on the decision-making process. Initially, it started from a law enforcement perspective, but I was surprised when I started trying to find areas that focus primarily on law enforcement to find out implicit bias started around mid-1960s, the research in the space of education and healthcare. And so I utilized a lot of that information when I developed my theoretical lens in which to look at my research as it relates to law enforcement. And I was more surprised when I had to go back to that space to look at current data to prepare this presentation. And what we're consistently seeing within the research is that implicit bias can have a major impact on the way that clinicians conduct consultations and make decisions for patients. But what's interesting is not covered in the medical field outside of the clinical reasoning. In other words, they focus more on the patient's outcomes versus his workforce, which is kind of the opposite when you look in the world of business. Where the world of business looks concentrated and focus more on the workforce itself. In 2019, they did a state of inclusion survey to where 64% of the workers surveyed felt they had experienced some form of bias in the space of microaggressions in their workplaces over the past year. And out of those, 61% felt that they experienced bias in the workplace at least once a month, which shows the prevalence of implicit bias in the workplace throughout the workforce industry. Studies indicate that healthcare professionals exhibit the same level of implicit bias as the wider population. In other words, people in healthcare are human. Throughout this presentation, because it's virtual, I will state my talking points on the presentation. So if I talk too fast for you, because I speak like a Yankee, but I do have a Southern twang for being now South working in law enforcement, just feel free to follow along with the presentation. My objectives for this presentation is to provide you a deep understanding in the areas of cultural awareness, cultural knowledge, cultural skills, and cultural competency. These are the tools that we as researchers have found is a great resource when it comes to mitigating implicit bias. There's no data that shows or indicates that you can remove it completely, but you can manage it. The 3 key elements you need are awareness, knowledge, and skills, which are the 3 key components of cultural competency as a whole. Cultural awareness is basically when a person becomes aware of their biases and have the ability to accept cultural differences and are open to a variety of worldviews and perspectives. In other words, you don't have to believe in it, but you are acceptance of it. Cultural knowledge is the knowledge of diverse cultures and groups as it pertains to their history, how they view the world, and their divergent perspectives. With a combination of awareness and knowledge comes the basic skills, which give you the ability to use cultural awareness and knowledge to recognize and freely discuss cultural issues and differences. In other words, with understanding comes empathy. With empathy comes transition and openness. Cultural competency is the ability to be more receptive, and you can speak more freely, practice, engage across all different cultures, no matter what the barriers are. Now, before we go any further, I want to make sure we truly understand the definitions as it relates to inequities within race, because sometimes people classify groups or view things in the wrong perspective. They don't fully understand the definition. So let's talk about racism. It's a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce and inherit superiority of a particular race. In other words, racism centers primarily around superiority. Prejudice, an unfair feeling or dislike for a person or group because of their race, sex, and religion. In other words, don't like you, can't respect you just based on who you are by definition. Discrimination, the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the ground of race. In other words, your actions or lack of their actions just because of a person and from the group they're associated with. Bigotry, obstinate or unreasonable attachment to the belief, opinion, or faction, and particular prejudice against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular group. And systemic racism. This is one, it's another one a lot of people get confused because they think it actually applies to an individual, but it's a system itself. It's a dynamic system that produces and reciprocates racial ideologies, identities, and inequities. In addition, it is a well-institutionalized pattern of discrimination that cuts across major political, economic, and social organizations within a society. And then what we're here for today, implicit bias. It's the mindset of stereotypes that influence our understanding, decisions, and actions in an unconscious manner. Now, if you actually take the core definition of implicit bias, you can almost go back to each definition and apply it. It all starts there. These ideas and perceptions all derive from implicit bias. And so if we can find a cure for implicit bias and manage and find a way to manage and mitigate this process, it will reduce the negative impact it have on people who are marginalized within our society. Next two definitions, culture. Culture is defined as a way of life, including arts, beliefs, and institutions of a population that are passed down from generation to generation. Culture has been called the way of life for the entire society. As such, it includes codes of manner, dress, language, religion, rituals, art, even foodies. Then within each culture, you have a subculture, an ethnic, regional, economic, or social group exhibiting characteristics of pattern of behavior sufficient to distinguish it from others within embracing a culture of society. It's important that as we go through this here discussion, that we understand when we talk about fixing a problem, you have to address the culture within that organization or institution, but also the subculture within that culture. So let's go ahead and put a controversial conversation on the floor to get our evening started. I find it controversial when working in both spaces, when I'm talking to a group of color or a group not of color. And this is why I find it very important to understand true definitions. And so being a researcher, I'm all about facts and data because it removes any personal perceptions. And so I always like to use the most relevant information that most people can connect with during these discussions. And the most recent one we're all aware of because of the national coverage is the death of Mr. Floyd when he was killed on May 25th of 2020. A lot of people, after watching the video, hearing the news, identified this former officer as a racist. And so as a researcher, I always like to get the facts, get the data, and make sure I address the proper label so when you come up to the solution to the problem, you can approach it correctly. It's almost like having a proper diagnosis to identify the cure. Here's a few facts I was able to pull from some of the research done and some of the data that was shared. Of course, we know he was arrested due to excessive force, former Officer Savon. He was charged with the murder of Mr. Floyd. He had 18 official complaints on his record, 2 of which was ended in some form of discipline, including official letters of reprimand. But there was no evidence pattern of racism. And that was because the department was using the actual definition of racism to identify or draw a correlation to see if that was the issue he was having within the Black community. Within those 18 complaints, it also expanded to people not of color. Based on the area he was assigned to, you may see a higher number of people of color, but that was where the access was at that time, as far as the people he was engaging with. But there was no pattern because they was only viewing it from the space of the definition of racism. They failed to also include implicit bias. After obtaining assistance from the FBI, the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison, admitted there was no evidence whatsoever that this officer was racist. They went through his emails. They went through his social media. They dug in deep and could not find a correlation between the two. Remember what a racist is. Somebody who have experienced racism or is racist. They have a mindset of superiority. They don't like to impact their bloodline. They're over entire groups who they feel is beneath them. He was married to a American, which chiefly is from China and Southeast Asia, and I think her family is from Laos. She described the marriage as strong and healthy. There was no complaints of abuse from her or from the family. Treated with respect. A racist wouldn't have done that. He also chose to work side jobs, working for clubs owned by people of color, both Black and Hispanic. A racist wouldn't intentionally put themselves in that position. This officer, based on how the scientific community looked at issues as it relates to race, had implicit bias. Data shows that this is the next new threat because it's hidden. It only appears when emotionally charged. It's very important that we identify the problem correctly so we can obtain the cure. I can tell you that even as a police commander, before I obtained this knowledge doing research, when an officer is accused of being a racist, I went by the sheer definition. And if I was not able to draw a correlation to his actions or comments to that, we wrote it off. Because during that period, when I was in command, we didn't understand or had any conception or working knowledge of implicit bias, which studies show this is the new big threat because it's hidden, it's hard to identify. In 2014, there was a significant spike in the number of police-related fatal shootings involving unarmed African-American men and young men. And this is after over $40 billion was spent in the what we call the COPS program, Community Policing Program, to address racism. But again, during this period, we did not understand or have the working knowledge about implicit bias. In 2016, this proportionate killings was identified as a public health and safety crisis. The research was done in 2016 also of 1,846 use of force cases involving officers. These officers did not have a history of displaying signs of racism, but one thing they consistently was able to draw a correlation was their implicit bias. Some of the common themes why these officers was not pulled or removed from the force or given further training. These incidents was no consistent pattern like a true racist would have, and it was always emotionally triggered incidents. Hunter and McCall and Brayson and Hunter identified implicit bias as a contributing factor in the decision-making process that occur when police officers encounter shoot or don't shoot training scenarios. They actually place these officers scenarios to trigger some of these emotions under stress. And they was able to draw a correlation between their biases and how they made their decision to shoot and not shoot. And so as a society, we have to ask ourselves that question. What is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. We're going to have to take a broader approach when it comes to addressing race issues within our culture. When asked by my good friend, Dr. Thomas, to do this presentation, I dug deep and dug hard to develop a multi-lens discussion for everybody tonight. Because the one thing I found that most of the research and focus is on the outcomes of the patient versus the providers. And I found a plethora of information on practices and research as applies to clinical care, but very few when it when it comes to the workforce itself. To date, research indicates that racial and ethnic minorities and women in healthcare report experiencing a lack of mentorship, sponsorship, barriers to promotion, equitable pay, advancement, support, and sometimes a hostile work environment. What I found kind of surprising was, in addition to this here, recently published reports include overt bigotry expressed towards Black, Indian, and Jewish heritage doctors by their patients. So people of color within the workforce of healthcare is catching it from both sides based on the data. Patient care studies show that racial and ethnic minorities and women are subject to less accurate diagnosis, curtailed treatment options, less pain management, and worse clinical outcomes. Remember in the beginning, I told you when I started doing my research, implicit bias came about around 1960, wasn't fully labeled till the mid to late 80s, but all the study and data occurred within the healthcare and education sector. Yet here we are today. So now we got to start working on those three skills we got to build up. And we're going to start in the space of awareness. What is implicit bias? Implicit bias has been defined as the mindset or stereotypes that influence our understanding, decisions, actions in an unconscious manner. Now, we're going to go ahead and acknowledge that in society, we have our racists. We're going to acknowledge we have our bigots. We're going to have our people with prejudice and people who discriminate. So we're going to put them in a jar over here. This conversation is centered around people who have implicit bias, which has been identified as the next new threat because it's unconscious. Their behavior and actions when in a structured environment displays one action, but when stressed or put in certain situations, their biases come out, which impact their decision-making process, which in turn has a negative impact on the individual on the other end, which is usually minorities. What's scary about it and what's so dangerous about it is a lot of people are very unaware of it. Research have emphasized that implicit bias is rooted in the automatic tendencies to categorize and stereotype people. We all do it. We all go by our preconceived notions based off our lived and learned experiences. It's hard to escape it. All we can do is really manage it. These thoughts are usually directed towards people outside of one's own race and ethnicity. And that's because without understanding, it's hard to empathize or to be able to quickly adjust. I love this little quote here. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. We tend to look at people through our own set of lens. And so the challenge is, how do we modify that behavior? And it all starts at as early as age 2. Our lived and learned experiences, which can be family, economic status, living situations, impact on our life experiences, which in turn impacts on how we see the world. Implicit bias accumulate during a lifetime of cultural immersion or lack thereof, and it's very difficult to remove. Bias can be either positive or negative and exists in everyone. And I'll give you an example of that. I have family members, friends, and colleagues when it comes to receiving health care from a practitioner. They tend to want to have one that's older because they feel if they're older, they have more knowledge versus the ones who may appear young or appear new. That's a bias. Now, it can be a positive bias in the sense, okay, you're giving homage to somebody with experience, but it can be a negative bias if you're making your health decisions based on your assumptions. How it works within us, it allows us to have inflexible beliefs about a group of people, and it enables us to make quick decisions, can be very explicit. I can give you an example of that. My wife is in the healthcare. She's from the islands, and she believes in eating healthy and organic. Well, I'm a cop and an ex-veteran. I believe a steak every day don't hurt, and eating vegetables out of cans is okay. But after almost 10 years, right, 10 years of marriage, I started conforming to her way of living and things. But to be able to maintain some kind of control or power in my household, I decided to have a bias against at least one veggie, which is the Brussels sprout. Never tried it, never tasted it, but I have an explicit hate for it. I have a bias by it because it don't look right. And to me, it's like a miniature cabbage. And I decided I don't like it. It's not factual based, never tasted it, never tried it. But because of my implicit bias on that one piece of veggie, I will tell anybody to the day I die, I do not like Brussels sprouts. But is there any validity to it? No. Never tried it, never experienced it. I have no proof that it'll harm me or even how it tastes. It can be something just that simplistic. But again, we all house biases. Bias is not an issue until it impacts our decision-making process and have a negative impact on somebody else. It can counter our conscious beliefs. We can tell ourselves, well, I don't have a bias against people of color. I don't have a bias against a certain group. But when put up under stress, when having to make emotional decisions, it's going to come out. Everyone has some level, but it's also necessary for survival. Some people call it gut instincts. If you really take apart what a gut instinct is, it's the instincts you develop through lived and learned experiences, which is implicit bias. How does it work? How do we gain these biases? It's through the process of schemas, which is a cognitive framework that helps us organize and interpret information. In other words, as we receive information in, we categorize it, box it, put it on the shelf until needed. However, this mental framework also causes us to exclude pertinent information to focus instead only on things that confirm our pre-existing beliefs and ideas. If you don't believe me, depending on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it's going to dictate what channel you watch. Whether it's going to be Fox News versus CNN versus MSNBC. What I find very interesting and fun is when I have friends or family members who say, well, I don't have any biases and I'm open to ideas. And if I know they're a Democrat, I say, okay, well, I want you to watch Fox News for 1 hour a day for 5 days and put the blood pressure cup on you and see if your pressure go up. And then vice versa with a Republican. We tend as a society to only want to seek information that's going to validate our preconceived ideas, which keep us boxed in, which keeps us within a culture that's counterintuitive to our growth as individuals. Bias reducing programs rest upon 2 qualifiers. First, individuals must be aware it exists. Because once you realize you have implicit bias, and it's okay, it's what makes us human. Then we become more concerned about what the harm it does. Then we start being more proactive to eliminate those bias. The only way you can eliminate those bias is through exposure and learning more about things that you may have negative thoughts about without validity. Education alone is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to reducing it. You have to be aware. You have to take and be meaningful about educating yourself. And you must understand it's going to be a long process. I'm 52 years of age. That means at age 2, I started developing my biases. That means over 50 years, I've accumulated lived and learned experiences that give me assumptions in my decision-making process. And so now I got to spend the next 50 years, if I'm around that long, to counter those. How our brain works and how we make our decisions. You have 2 sides of your brain. One system is intuitive, it's fast, it's based off of impressions. We arrive at solutions more quickly, but it makes us more prone to mistakes. System 2 is slower, more deliberate. It seeks to test concepts and detect complexity and nuance. We're rarely ever in this space. All of us, as functioning human beings, rely more on the intuitive side. Analytical only comes about when we're problem solving or conducting some type of research in the area that we have an interest in, that we have have a lack of information. But we mainly stay in the space of intuitive mindsets, which, when emotionally triggered, exposes our biases. We make those snap decisions. The human brain can only process approximately 11 million bits of information per second. So in other words, we take in per second 11 million bits of information, but only can consciously be aware of 40 bits per second. In other words, out of 11 million bits of information, we only can effectively process 40 bits. So how we survive and function within society is by taking mental shortcuts. And these mental shortcuts derive from our lived and learned experiences. And a lot of people are, well, how does that work? Well, think about it. If you go back to when you was a child learning how to tie your shoes, it was a process, right? Mom or dad had to sit there with us and walk us through the loops and things of that nature. And it was a process. But once we've mastered the art of that, now we do it subconsciously. I don't think any of us in this space now literally sit there and think about how we tie our shoes on a day-to-day basis. Now let's talk about the culture a little bit, gain some of that knowledge. The concept of cultural competence was initially developed and implemented within the healthcare sector towards the end of the 1980s through research. Positive results related to implicit bias training have been reported to some extent within the healthcare system and education system, but more extensively in the private sector. Again, the healthcare system focuses more on patient outcomes versus workforce, and so did the education system, where the private sector focuses more on employees. Because when you look in both spaces, the healthcare and education system is worried about liability, as such as the private sector. But the private sector liability remains within its workforce when it comes to lawsuits. There's an overwhelming amount of scientific literature describing the impact of implicit bias on patient care, but a minimum amount on healthcare workforce in comparison. So let's talk about patient care for a second. Multiple studies indicate that physicians with high levels of implicit bias commandeer the snippet portion of the patient-physician talk during their appointments. Especially when dealing with people of color, they tend to dominate the conversation and rarely seek substantial input from the patient itself. Studies also indicate that the terminology or the wordage that physicians use signal implicit bias with the patients of color, which then cause them to assess the power dynamics, social dominance, and then become withdrawn from it. Saying something simple as, "We're going to take our medicine right." In other words, asking them, "Are we going to follow these directions?" can be very condescending to an individual, especially if they're older than you. Studies indicate that race-related attitudes of both non-Black physicians and their Black patients negatively affect what transpires during their medical interactions and outcomes. When a person feels that there's a presence of bias, the trust goes away, which then in turn limits the back and forth and the collection of information needed to make the appropriate diagnosis. Studies also within this, the culture of physicians indicate that the male staff are less sympathetic versus the female staff when interacting with patients, which I kind of found interesting. Because it's been my experience when talking to female family members or friends, when I'm caught in that conversation of gynecologists, they tend to say the opposite, that they feel more comfortable going to a male because they seem to be more sympathetic versus a female. But we got to go with what the data says. The data says opposite and stuff. But I found it kind of interesting when I was reading some of the research and verifying it through 4 different resources. Knowledge within the workforce. Back in 1989, the American Medical Association acknowledged that for over more than 100 years, there was issues of racial inequities within the culture itself and vowed to right the wrongs. They've continuously done surveys, both qualitative and quantitative, within the physician minority group, and found that there's still reported instances of racism, discrimination from both patients, colleagues, and institution itself. So just imagine, they acknowledged 100 years prior to 1989, but yet here we are today. And even preparing for this lecture, I found very little evidence in comparison. There's things taking place, but very little evidence in comparison to research and things being meant for the patients versus the doctors. And remember, this is a culture, so you cannot fix one without the other. Some of the examples that the doctors who were surveyed gave was assumption that participants were actually not physicians. We've actually seen this on TV where you've had medical emergencies and female physicians of color was denied access to a person who's needing their assistance. Inappropriate comments about their race, structural bias that led to substantially fewer advancement opportunities. Research also found that microaggressions experienced at work by study participants were significantly correlated with secondary traumatic stress and important elements of professional quality of life. In other words, not only do physicians or healthcare workers of color or from within the female group have to deal with the day-to-day stress of the job, but the data is showing a correlation between how having to deal with implicit bias and microaggressions from not only their colleagues, peers, and the system itself, also the patient had a negative impact on their professional quality of life. So now we're going to talk about some of the solutions. Is basically the one solution that the scientific community agree on as a whole is cultural competence. Enhancing the level of cultural competence within the workspace or within society as a whole, because our workforce come from our communities. And this is done by enhancing the levels of cultural competence. This theory was developed again back in the 1980s when they was doing research in the space of healthcare sector on trying to identify ways to improve patient outcomes. This theory is designed to modify behaviors, practices, and attitudes through training in a manner that promotes the ability to work effectively in cross-cultural environments. Cultural competency is the ability to interact positively with diverse cultures, beliefs, practices, and language. I'm going to say that over and over again. As you expand your levels of cultural competency, it gives you the tools you need to work within any space. And the key to cultural competency is bringing about awareness, knowledge. And with awareness, knowledge, you will have the skills to effectively interact in any space. And so how it works in the dynamics is first you have to become aware that it exists. Then you have to gain cross-cultural knowledge. Then it's need to apply to health literacy, delivery of care, and advocacy. And then repeat. It's an ongoing process. So let's talk about how we can apply some of these skills. First, we got to change the culture, right? We have to take and expand that culture. An essential element in reducing implicit bias is changing the culture within the system, aka groupthink. In other words, until the majority of the group thinks in the aspect of diversity, you cannot make any changes. Modifying the culture will require a set of congruent behaviors. In other words, everybody has to be aligned with not only the policies, but practice within the system. So we almost have to replace systemic racism with systemic cross-cultural beliefs. The approach requires the capacity to value diversity because statistically, it's been shown that a diverse group perform at a 37% higher rate because now you have a diversity of thought. Conduct self-assessments. It's an ongoing process. Even with me, being a person of color, I still work on the daily basis on mitigating my biases. And I always do self-assessment. Something simple as if I see something, hear something, and I automatically go to the negative without having a valid excuse, that lets me know when my bias was triggered. So then I start peeling back the layers, asking myself, why? Why do you feel that way? Manage the dynamics of the difference, acquire institutionalized cultural knowledge, and adapt to diversity and the cultural context of the communities they serve and the workforce. So we have to modify the culture within healthcare to not only focus on the patient care, but the workforce itself. Change the culture within the system is a long-term process. Again, we develop our biases starting at about around age 2, and it progresses. So it's not going to be modified overnight. I require frequent evaluations, that can be surveys and modifications. You have to adjust as needed. Outcomes can be measured by improved quality of care and employee satisfaction. Then we could look at patient care. We need to recognize that a response can appear to be stereotyping and adjust when needed. Like I said, something simple as, are we going to take our medicine today? Some people seem very condescending. And so we have to be very self-aware of that. We can counter implicit bias by imagining the patient as the opposite of the perceived stereotype. A lot of times, we being human, we may go in and apply what we call the 7-11 rule. In 7 seconds, make 11 assumptions. When you automatically see yourself going to the negative when interacting with a patient or colleague, let's take a step back and ask ourselves why and try to counter that belief. Treat each patient as an individual rather than a stereotype. Focus more on them as on a personal history and in a context and what brought them to your office. Because sometimes as humans, as a society, especially in the space you're in, because I can tell you, I can identify being in law enforcement, we tend to see the same thing. After our 6 months in, 1 year in, 2 year in, we become complacent. We start stereotyping, placing people in different groups because of the constant movement of people through our space and through our lived and learned experiences, right? And so we have to work towards countering those beliefs. Even if you have a person, even one study showed that every time individuals come from one particular zip code, the assumption was there based off simply a zip code. So how do we counter that? By creating a space of individualism, looking at each person for who they are, not from where they come from. Put yourself in their shoes to better understand their perspective. Try to understand why they react that way, why they may fail to follow some of your healthcare advice. Is it access? Is it a cultural issue? And also reframe the interaction with patients as one between collaborating equals rather than between a high status person. I'm sorry, reframe person or low status. In other words, when you speak to the patient, speak to them at the same level. Sometimes we tend to, when we're power of knowledge, we tend to talk down to people subconsciously without even realizing it. Then the workforce. We need to implement ongoing training that creates a space to address, discuss the negative impact of implicit bias and how to mitigate it. It should be an ongoing process. It's going to take time. You're looking at trying to remove years of lived and learned experience that may have had a negative impact on an individual to where they perceive a group a certain way. But also remember, your workforce is always changing. Expand one networks of friends and colleagues, or attend events where people of other race, racial and ethnic groups and gender are different from you, or sexual orientation. I'm always looking for spaces to meet new people with divergent perceptions and ideas so I can learn more about why they think that way. I can tell you I've grown over the years. And the more I've expanded my circles, the more I've grown as an individual. And it assists me in learning more on how to interact effectively cross-culturally. Recognize situations that magnify stereotyping and bias. And when you recognize it, professionally address it. And understand and respect the tremendous power of unconscious bias. Because again, having implicit bias is not a bad thing. It makes us human. But implicit bias become a problem when it impacts your decision-making process and has a negative impact on others. Some of the don'ts we want to do sorry, skipped over there. Some of the do's we want to do when taking mitigation action items. Mentor and coach people who are not like you. That will give you the opportunity to, number one, learn more about that particular culture or group, but number two, to help break down some of those barriers. I'll provide opportunities to people who typically are being overlooked. And I'm pretty sure when you look around certain spaces in your life, you can at least know one person falls in that space. So take the time to reach out and open the door for them. Identify individuals or groups who may feel excluded in your workplace and take actions to address the circumstances. I hope that everybody kind of see where I'm going with this here. It shouldn't be just a top-down issue. It should be a bottom-up issue. Some of the don'ts. Overlook people who are less extroverted or have fewer opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. Sometimes you see that quiet person in the corner who's not actually engaging. You may want to ask the why. You may want to create an opportunity to open up an invitation to assist them in engaging. Because a lot of times you'll find they have a lot to add to the conversation or to the problem. Overlook the value of professional affinity groups and events that can help you grow and understand the diversity. If you have an affinity group within your organization, you should make every effort to either support it or learn more about it to expand your cultural competency. Don't underestimate the value of feedback from trusted colleagues and peers regarding your actions and behaviors in the workplace. If you know they have your respect and they're telling you something that may apply to your negative behavior, take a moment, take a step back and embrace that feedback and try to make those adjustments where you'll be more effective within your workspace. And a quick summary. Implicit bias often runs counter to people-conscious beliefs. We can tell ourselves that we're open and honest and understanding people, that we see no negative in anyone that's not well deserved. And that's why we call it implicit bias. It's hard to recognize. It usually takes an emotional trigger before it comes out. Few physicians espouse racial discriminatory views, yet doctors tend to recommend less pain medication for Black patients than for white patients with the identical injury. That's to this date, after years of studying this being identified. In other words, people can explicitly say they're unbiased, but yet implicitly be biased. According to some of the psychologists, Danielle Kelly and his colleagues who've done recent research in that space. And so we have to be very self-aware that we all hold it. It don't make us bad people. It don't become a problem, make us bad people when we recognize it and we fail to acknowledge it and modify the behavior. We all have implicit bias that affects the way we live and work in the world. Identify how these biases may negatively affect others, and the bottom line is pivotal to the development of workplace equality. Once I became aware of a lot of my biases, the first thing I went was into maximum overdrive to modify the behavior, because it was not my intention to have a negative impact on others based off my assumptions or lived and learned experiences. And that's kind of brought me to where the place I am today, CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters. When I went to law enforcement, I put a lot of young men who look just like me into the system, because in the area I grew up in and the things I've seen, I wanted to clean up the communities where people who look like me lived. And because of my biases, the only solution I had was arrest the problem away instead of identifying alternative methods. And that was not my intentions. My intention was to go in and assist the community. So sometimes good intentions can be clouded by bad judgment, lack of information, and things of that nature. So don't bring that into your space, because people's lives depend on it. Bringing awareness to our unconscious bias and take actions that cross-check our initial assumptions can help limit the negative consequences. So at this time, I'll open the floor up for questions. All I ask you to do is be respectful and avoid personal attacks on others, be open to ideas and other thoughts and perspectives, and questions should center around the topic. So I'll turn it over to you, Sherry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitfield. What a wonderful talk. And this subject is so important for all of us who are just dealing with people, just being a human in the world. I think this is applicable information to all of us, and especially for those of us who are in healthcare. I don't see any questions just yet, but I want to lead with a question of my own, if you don't mind. So, as I mentioned before you got started, we are in the process of developing curriculum for providing this kind of training to future physicians. And so, what my first question is, how often do you recommend that we do implicit bias training, kind of from an institutional standpoint, kind of addressing the workforce issue?
Well, when you consider, if it was up to me, I say every 3 months, right? Every quarter, right? But we have to be realistic. With training come costs. Also, it comes impact on manpower. So if you can create a space to where annually you have a actual training session to where it's in person, to where you can have the conversation, I think that'd be sufficient. But biannually, create a space to where you can have within each workspace, subculture, to where you can have group sessions that's led by a facilitator, such as yourself, who's an expert in this space, and things of that nature, and just have that discussion. Even when I rarely do presentations in this space, but because I've monitored what you all do, you kind of prep this space, right? Because I'm more of a one-on-one person, and I think it should be a two-way conversation. Me giving you information and you sharing your thoughts, and then adjust accordingly, right? Because we're talking about modifying behavior. We're talking about addressing a perception based off of lived experiences from age 2, and that's something that cannot be done overnight. And so, I think having that in-person training by a trained facilitator once a year, and then at least 6 months after that initial training, creating a space to where you can pull a team together that works within the culture and having an open conversation. And it has to be an ongoing process, because during those conversations, when properly facilitated, comes growth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I was furiously taking some notes so I can formulate this and organize it better. It looks like we have some questions here in the chat. So the first question is, do you have any thoughts on how we can help others recognize their implicit biases, particularly in our clinical environments?
Yes, that's so when you say us, so again, when doing this type of, I hate calling it training, have these type of discussions, because when you say training, I found through my experience, people tend to feel being force-fed, right? And again, you're gonna hear me say 1,000 times, we're trying to modify behavior that's based off of lived and learned experiences. So that's not gonna happen overnight. And so the most effective way, because my research was centered around how do the training impacts the individual's decision-making process. And I found in my research, because it was so new when it first come out, the training was very ineffective. And so it had the opposite impact. and stuff. People walked away from the training feeling accused, feeling belittled, and was on the defensive the entire time. And so that we have to be very careful in that space, right? So I think if you're talking about within the group itself, either you train your staff on how to have that conversation, and or either bring in a facilitator, because now we're talking about personal beliefs and perception, and that can be very touchy. And these people, after that discussion, have to work together. And so even when I do a training to where I open the floor as part of the training, I always remind them, don't see me as a person of color, and just see me as Dr. Whitfield, who's a qualitative researcher, who's not going to be offended by what you say. I'm going to be more curious on why you said it and stuff, right? Because my job is to identify the lack of information you had to give you that perception and fill in those gaps. Knowing that's not going to, you're not going to walk away with a changed perspective, but at least plant that seed. Because again, we're countering previous learned and lived experiences. I always tell people, when in this space, you can never be wrong to me. Your lived and learned experiences, your lived and learned experiences. I'm okay with that. The only time we may have a difference of opinion is when you refuse to receive new information. At least go look it up and research it yourself. And so if you're going to do it within that space, within a work group, it has to make sure the person who's going to facilitate that conversation has the skills and the tools to maneuver, because it's going to be very touchy. And if everybody's being honest, it's going to be very touchy and sensitive. And you want to make sure everybody walk away feeling fulfilled and not attacked or judged. I hope that wasn't a long-winded answer, but it's a very touchy space.
It is. No, that wasn't long-winded at all. Let's see. It looks like we have a few more questions here. Dr. Sinwani, did you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Dr. Chalmers. Dr. Whitfield, wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it. Very illuminating. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, sir.
By definition, you mentioned that implicit bias is something ingrained or something in our subconscious or unconscious that we are even ourselves not aware of.
Yes.
I agree with you when you said that training is required, but we have to go into our deep, dark spaces inside that we don't recognize. So
Yes.
my question for you is, because it's brought forth by stress, because it's brought forth by conflict, when you yourself don't know when it's going to come out, is mindfulness a training? Does it have a role to play when you can look inwards, analyze yourself, and be aware of your own reaction in real time? Has there been any study, according to your research, that mindfulness helps with mitigating implicit bias, or that's more of a cuckoo thing?
Yeah. Doctor, I'll make sure I pronounce right. Is it Sinwani?
That's correct. That's
Okay.
right.
See, one thing about me, I'm going to force myself to learn. And so I'll put myself out there. And that's what implicit bias, and cultural comps is all about, right? Putting ourselves in those uncomfortable positions. Now, great question. I can tell you, once you embrace awareness and realize it's okay to have implicit bias, it's only a problem when it impacts your decision-making process and have a negative impact on others. Then you're more prone to dive in deep. But if you take a step back and actually think about it, how many people really feel comfortable evaluating themselves to the level to exposing that side of them? What I found worked for me was, when I find myself having that negative thought, is to stop, peel back the layers, and try to figure out why. And I'll share an experience with you. I do a lot of volunteer work. And through doing volunteer work with the American Red Cross, I got a chance to meet Mr. Dean Neese, who's a good friend of mine now. And while working on the project together, he said, I think you'll be a good Rotarian. He said, I want to invite you to one of our lunches and see if you want to join. And so I said, okay, great. I like doing volunteer work. And so a little background about me, my family's intermixed racially. I have a biracial daughter who's a young adult now. I've dated outside of my race. When I worked in law enforcement down south, it was predominantly white. Have a lot of white friends. I hate to say that cliche. But when I went to this meeting, Toledo had the 10th largest Rotary in the world. And when I went to the meeting and I was being introduced and we had lunch and was having a conversation, I felt very uncomfortable. My implicit bias was exposed. Great conversations, like-minded people, but the Toledo Rotary have a very small percentage amount of people of color and women. So I looked around the room, it was a bunch of older white males, business leaders, business owners, but I'm in that space. But I felt very uncomfortable and made an excuse to get out of there. As soon as I made it to now this is within the past couple of years. This is after doing research, right? Teaching, preaching about this stuff. So I made it down to my vehicle. I said, wait a minute, something's not right. Did I just self-express implicit bias to myself? Why was I uncomfortable with like-minded people? And so I told myself, I need to go back to a couple of meetings. I need to insert myself in that space of uncomfortability and figure out why. When I peel back the layers, that was the first time throughout my history that I've been in a space with predominantly powerful white people. And so it exposed it. And so through exposing myself a few more times, I was able to reduce those levels of implicit bias to where I joined the Rotary and been a proud Rotarian for the past couple of years. So your question is great, but we'll actually have to look at the space of how many people would actually intentionally expose themselves to that. And so my answer is, in order to be successful, is to find something that you normally wouldn't do and do it. And me and my wife talk about that all the time. And she know I have a rule of 3. If I'm asked at least 3 times to do something I normally wouldn't do, or participate in something I normally participate in because of my biases, because I've never done it, think I don't like it, I have to go with the 3rd one. I guarantee you, if you stick by that and you have a couple of bad 3rd ones, you're going to start really looking at the first 2. And so now when I'm asked to do something I normally wouldn't do or expose myself to something I normally expose myself to, I kind of strongly consider the first 1 or 2 because I never know what that 3rd one's going to be. And it's going to be through exposure. Exposure. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, putting yourself in spaces you normally wouldn't be in to trigger those emotions. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Whitfield, we have another question here. It reads, do you have suggestions for having these discussions, perhaps in a class-wide way, without putting the onus on minority students to be the main educators in these discussions or putting them in uncomfortable positions?
Yes. Let's see how I'll answer that one. Sometimes when people with good intentions want to help a cause, they don't take in consideration the people they're trying to assist and the impact they can have. Could you imagine being a minority in a space and being talked about to your peers or colleagues, and then especially if the talk is in a way designed to make them feel bad? And now in your mind, all eyes on me because I brought this problem to the forefront. So you have to be extra careful. Even when I've been to areas such as Dublin, Ohio, to where they don't even have African Americans within their city. I think they may have a few Asians. And so even in that space, when talking to those officers, I have to be very self-aware when having these conversations on the impact the conversation is going to have on them. The goal is to educate them to enhance their level of awareness and knowledge to give them those skills without putting them in a defensive posture to where they're not receptive. And so to go back to the question itself, you have to be very careful in that space. And if you're going to do it, you got to make sure that you don't put those students in the space to where they feel like they're being objectified, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Let's see. Are there any other questions for Dr. Whitfield? See, I don't see anything else in the chat at the moment.
Can I ask a question? Usually it's a back and forth. I always like to call it a conversation. So if anybody in the room want to answer this conversation. So a quick question for you, Dr. Thomas. How long has
Yeah.
this group been together for our students in this class course?
So this series has been going on for quite a while. I don't know exactly what the time frame is, but it's been happening for at least over a year that I've been aware of. The Office of Diversity and Inclusion has been functioning for several years, and Dr. Kim Jenkins is the Associate Dean for that. Dr. Alicia James is Assistant Dean for that office. And so some of this lecture series is born out of the endeavors that have come through that office, and has just really been a valuable resource. And I think one of the things that's been a little bit challenging is that some of this started right when COVID hit. So our ability to have these conversations in more of the preferred inpatient setting was disrupted. And
Okay.
so I really admired the effort to utilize the virtual format, even though it's not ideal for these kinds of conversations, to continue to keep this dialogue going.
And great job in that space. I can tell you that initially, when a lot of my clients asked me to go virtual, I'm like, now I just have to be there in person so I can read the room and have the back and forth. But then when we got 6 months to a year in, I had to ask myself the question, what's more important, getting information out there or delivering it in an ideal format? But I asked that question to ask this question before we go to the next question. Can anybody that's here within the webinar, um, uh, would they be okay sharing what has been the impact of some of the training or lectures or information that's being provided within the university setting have had on them in modifying their behavior or feeling more included in the process? If anybody care to answer that question.
Dr. Whitfield, I'll take that question. This is Puneet Sandwani again.
Thanks, sir.
I came here in 2016 and I was appointed the chairman of the Department of Urology. Now, when you think of urology, what comes to your mind? Males, caring for males.
Mhm.
But that should not be the case because there are so many female patients who needed urologic care also. And as you mentioned, there is a big implicit bias for patients how or for whom they want to seek care from. Man discussing urologic problem with the female physician, there was a big bias. And that's why historically, urology was dominated by men. And that to a very unique substrata of men of the society that occupy that space. So after attending some of the implicit bias training and looking inwards, I'm proud to say that urology right now has 50% residents who are females. Our department has been most diverse clinical department right now, urologic department in the nation. We were recognized by the Society of Academic Urology. And that's because we started realizing after this training, after these discussions, that the bias is not only racial bias we think about, but the
Yes.
gender bias, but the geographic bias, in the sense that is a resident who is trained in a smaller institute from a med school coming from Georgia, is this candidate going to be better than somebody coming from New York City? Simple things that you automatically started thinking. A person with rural background, how are they going to fit into the department as compared to somebody from urban background? So it helped me personally to be aware of moment to moment thoughts. And that's why I found the change in me when I started looking inwards. And that's where I thought mindfulness was helping me. In my department now, twice a year with my residence faculty and staff, we do mindfulness exercises and training. I cannot tell you for sure that it is helping me with implicit bias, but it is at least making my department more self-aware of their own thoughts as they arise. just like the example you gave, sitting in Rotary meeting, you were aware of your own thoughts. And I thought that was the utmost example of being mindful of your own self. So thank you for sharing that example. And this is how it has helped me of being aware. And that's how my department has changed going back 5 years. So there's discrete results, and I'm very happy with the training we got.
Great. And Dr. Sinwani, now that you've shared that additional information with me, in that aspect, yes to your question, because you've done what we talked about earlier. Remember, a culture and then subcultures. So I love the fact that you decided to change the subculture within your culture, and to practice mindfulness and to make that part of your subculture, which in turn, once it becomes part of the culture within your team or your colleagues, then the mindfulness is automatic. Like now, if you go in my office, my home office, I have little journals where I write things down that I need to look at or look into, to examine, okay, why do I feel this way? Why is my perspective this way? To self-reflect. But that's a process that you have to develop. That's something you have to embrace. That's why in the scientific community, when we say, how do you mitigate implicit biases? 3 key components: awareness, knowledge, and skills. But the first component is awareness. You have to be aware of it. And I can tell you from my experience, it was mind blowing. I dedicated my first half of my life to law enforcement. And it was by sheer accident, because most of my life I've been a facilitator and a trainer, law enforcement, military, and the private sector. And so when I seen that spike in 2013, 2014, when I was deciding what I was going to do research in, my research was from the aspect of the training, how's implicit bias training impacting law enforcement decision-making process. And through that space, as I gained more knowledge doing my lit review, I realized just how biased I was, and against people who look just like me. So I tell anybody, if me as a person of color can have hidden biases I was not aware of, going in the space with good intentions and do unintended damages, why are you surprised when people who do not look like me possess that? Because we only know what we don't know. We only know what we know, right? It's what we don't know is dangerous. And so you made a conscious decision, and hand claps, to change that. And when you embrace the awareness, you're going to thirst for that knowledge. You want to know more about, why do you think that way? Why do you react that way? Because now you truly appreciate the threat. And another thing too, and you just actually solidified what I talked about earlier, the data shows diversity of thought increases outcomes. Businesses have already identified this here. And by you diversifying that group and making females inclusive in that process, is only going to enhance your capabilities. So hats off. And so in that space, mindfulness will work, because it's a group, remember we talk about group think, right? And so when you enter a culture, we adjust to our culture, we acclimate. And so by you creating that culture, I'm hoping it's going to expand outside of your subgroup into the community itself.
Thanks so much. Would you be willing to come to Grand Rounds to my department and give us a 30-minute, 1-hour talk to my residents, my staff? I would really love that.
Well, based off the work you're doing, I'm gonna be honest. I'll do it, but I'm coming there just to, as a qualitative researcher, I like to understand the reason why and the impact. And so I would love to come there, give the talk, and ask the questions and learn more about the process, so I can share that information with others.
Thank you so much. I'll connect.
Mhm.
Did any of the other participants have any comments? Feel free to use the chat. I think not all of you can unmute your microphones.
But if you do, if you would like to be unmuted, just raise your hand and I can add you as a panelist to speak. Just let us know.
Dr. Thomas, is there best way to reach Dr. Whitfield Can I get that information from you?
I just put it in the chat for you.
Oh,
Thank you, sir.
perfect.
Yes.
Can everybody see that Dr. Whitfield has put his information in the chat?
Well, I'm gonna tell you like I tell everybody else when I'm doing a conference or a conversation. If you don't have questions, I'm gonna ask questions. I'm always curious to learn. I'm gonna pick on you, Dr. Thomas, if you don't mind.
Okay. Not at all.
Yes. So being a female in a male-dominant field, being a person of color in a field where there's very few minorities, and now having a better understanding of the why and the challenges that your culture faces. And being in this space that we talked prior to everybody coming on board, you've been here for, I think, going on your third year. Was it 2019 you said you started?
And in this particular, working with this particular group, it's been, yes, 2 years.
And so can you kind of give me an overview of some of the impact and some of the challenges? And some of the things that some of the places you think you need to go with this just to modify the culture.
Yes, I think what's difficult is that education seems to move at a very slow pace when it comes to these kinds of initiatives, generally speaking. And I think what's hard about that is that it's really talking about a change in culture, which is always difficult. People tend to be comfortable with what they know. Medical education has been very comfortable with, learning about the body, how it works and how it doesn't. And then, really kind of over the last, couple of decades, starting to move away from the more paternalistic approach to medicine, I think has really kind of opened up the opportunities for us to have more of these conversations about whether or not how we provide care is really what's best for the patients. And I think the other piece of this is the recognition in medicine that we cannot simply focus on the patient and disease process, but on the patient as a whole person, and how everything from a patient's belief system that they come in with to external societal factors are going to impact their health and impact their ability to be healthy in, even with our best efforts and advice and, collaborations or desires for collaboration. So I think that that's made it a little bit of a difficult process. As far as the educational portion is concerned, which is where I come in with really starting to examine the medical curriculum and looking at, okay, are we actually providing the future physicians that we are teaching with the tools that they need to be able to practice in a way that doesn't negatively impact patients, despite the fact that we're all human, right? And so how do we best do that? And so looking at best practices at other institutions, looking at what the research shows about how to have these conversations. And I know you and I talked a little bit before your official part of your talk began about kind of that workshop conversation component that's so important. And then the fact that this is a process, it's not a one-time lecture, it's lifelong learning, really. And I think in medicine that actually works very beautifully because medicine as a career is lifelong learning. There's a need for reflective practice, right? Even in just, if you're just looking at learning how to, or staying on top of the literature, or staying on top of best practices, or doing things better for your patient, that reflection piece is an important component of being a physician. And thinking about how we address our implicit biases follows that same pattern. So to me, they really go hand in hand. And so I think that medical education has really identified the importance of having these discussions. And I'm very grateful to be participating in a time where it's very obvious to kind of the governing bodies of medical education that these are important components of the education of physicians and not just disease and disease processes.
You know what I find interesting? That when I know you have different types of when you look at the healthcare profession as a whole, different aspects, different perspectives. But, you know, when I was actually preparing this lecture or presentation, I kind of thought to myself, you know, they kind of almost fall, they almost, initially, the healthcare profession as a whole, when trying to address this, was making the same fatal mistakes that law enforcement did, you know. Let's do some forced training one time and it's fixed. But
Right.
here we are every 15 years, right? But the difference between law enforcement and healthcare is y'all have clinicians who do counseling, who their predicate is this is going to take time because we're talking about modifying human behavior. So this is going to take place over extended process. And so I'm kind of curious, you know, if we're talking about modifying human behavior, why aren't we bringing in some of those experts to say, okay, how should this look? Right. And one thing,
Exactly.
one thing I like about what you said and Dr. Sawani said was that it's a you both accept this. It's a process where it has to be long-term, strategic, and ongoing. And you always trying to bring in other resources, other perspectives. And even in my research, when we did the surveys on some of the training attendees, that was some of the, it was all about the facilitator, all about access, all about delivery, right? Because if you think about it in a holistic perspective, we're telling people, hey, the way you feel and think is wrong. Everything you've learned at this point in some spaces may be wrong. And we want you to change this overnight. Well, I can tell you right now, it's nothing you can convince me in a matter of minutes. That was lifelong with me, right? You're going to sit there and show me the facts and things of that nature. And even then, I'm going to be kind of hesitant because I'm first of all, I'm shocked that I don't, that's not me. That's not my behavior. Even when doing my lit review, when I did that lit review, every time I seen the data and the facts, this can't be true. This can't be true. And halfway through the lit review, I went to a state of depression. Wow. I think we have, as law enforcement, have a negative impact on society than a positive. And then by the time I finished it, I went full circle because also I want to caution everybody within this space. Healthcare has made some progress. The sheer fact I'm here tonight shows that. The sheer fact that Dr. Sawani's doing, he's doing, shows that. The sheer fact that Dr. Thomas doing what she's doing, and she's here and presenting, putting together, shows that. But we do have to acknowledge we still have a ways to go, right? People's lives depend on it and things of that nature. But I like the fact that you're looking at a long-term strategic approach that's going to consist of different approaches. But the one most effective thing is the conversation. Having that conversation in an effective manner where everybody walk away either with a planted seed, and the facilitators need to understand that not everybody's going to be receptive immediately because you're feeding them information that they didn't have before. And how can we plant those seeds and keep the conversation going in a positive manner? And the most important thing is not everybody's a good facilitator. So you want to make sure those people are groomed and trained on how to control those conversations. I'll sometimes go and listen to other people speak. And halfway through their talk, I'm like, I hope they're not doing a Q&A at the back end of this here. Because I'm watching the room and they're going to get attacked. And they try to be structured. Everything I do is pretty much like I told Dr. James, I'm organic and stuff. And I'm very open-minded. And I'm okay if you have a divergent perspective. If anything, I'm going to be more curious on why you think that way and things of that nature so I can grow as a person, understand, and to make sure that you have your ebbs and flows within the discussion. I cringe when I go to workshops or in spaces to where it's all negative, you know, because if that was so, I wouldn't be sitting where I'm sitting. My wife wouldn't be where she's at, and you wouldn't be where you are. Now, again, I'm going to repeat, there's a lot of work to be done, but change is happening. And so that have to also be mentioned in the space of the talk. We got to have some wins in there while we discuss the seriousness of this problem, because people are losing their freedom and people are losing their lives, right? That's very important. But we also have to win those allies. You know, we have to win those allies because when we win those allies, and they're going to go back and they're going to share what they've learned. And so as facilitators of the conversation, we have to remember that too and stuff. So hats off to what you all doing and putting together. When I say when you have these conversations, I look at it from three approaches outside of the awareness, knowledge, and skills is to, okay, how can I deliver this information to where it's consumable? How can I provoke the thought process? And how can I recruit some allies and go back and repeat what they've heard, or at least ask the question.
Wonderful. Dr. Whitfield, I was second year resident when there's a study that came out, so it's 94 or 95, when it was shown that the moment a student starts presenting to their attending with the opening sentence, 45 years old, African American male, Caucasian male, or Hispanic male, the way the patient is going to be approached changes right there and then.
Yes.
I think it came up Hopkins, if I remember correct. And from there on, we made sure when you're presenting just to say, whatever 45 years old male presents with this. And that study was so powerful, left me shaken, because that's what I was taught in med school. And I kept on doing it forever. And I refused to believe that first time. They said, no, that can't be possible. But they showed that the differential diagnosis was different in that study scenario, and how you would approach it if it was the race was mentioned in it.
Yes. Dr. Sawani, do this and challenge your colleagues and your students. Self-consciously start paying attention to how you, your friends, or family, or peers mention race when mentioning a positive or negative act. Very seldom will race be mentioned when it's something positive. When it's something negative, the race is going to come out within the first sentence or two.
Wow.
That even happens within my space, work and home. And I have to remind myself or whoever's talking, why is that important? The fact the person did this wrong thing should be we focus on, right? No matter what race or color they are or whatever. But it's just so I do it sometimes, just subconsciously, and I have to catch myself and say, okay, how can I counter that? Because now I'm applying a racial behavior that we all do at some point. When have a negative reaction or make a negative comment. But that we always want to apply a race to an action, but it normally takes place when there's something negative. And all we're doing is reinforcing stereotypes, because I always tell people, and I was shocked, if you'd have asked me in 2009, right before I retired from law enforcement, who would most like to kill me in line of duty, I told you a black person. If you'd asked me 4 years later, I told you a black person. It wasn't until 2013 I started collecting the data that I discovered that more police officers killed in line of duty by whites versus blacks. Not saying that whites are more violent, it's just more of them. At the highest point, it was only 17% of the population. Now we're averaging around about 14% of the population. So just by sheer statistics, it's impossible. But for all of my career and shortly after I retired, I always thought the biggest threat was people who look just like me, even though the data showed different. But what tricks us is that per capita, right? That per capita thing they tell us. And I was having a good discussion with a police agency, a law enforcement agency, and we was having a debate. Well, not a debate. I was giving them data. They was giving their perspective. And so I said, okay, I'll never challenge your perspective because your live and learn experience is what you live and learn. But let me ask you a question. So we're going to use that per capita methodology. We're going to say 100 to 1. And so I want 10 of you all to line up to my left and one of you to line up to my right. Okay, you're the African American and you're white. Now, everybody ball make a fist. I asked that gentleman to stand up. Now let's go by per capita. Do you want to walk here, walk to my right and get struck once, or do you walk to my left and get struck 10 times? And then the light bulb went on, right? Because now we're applying that theory and concept. And so sometimes, whether it's systemic or intentional, we love using that per capita when we take and identify with a group, right? And that's where a lot of the false information come out. And I fell right into that trap, and every time I had a incident dealing with a person of color in a space I didn't feel comfortable, when I was mostly triggered, my hand went near my sidearm. And so I look at it from two perspectives: as a person of color, but also I was a defensive tactics instructor for law enforcement. And so now I challenge a lot of agencies, if for no other reason but for selfish reasons, we need to look deeper into implicit bias, because I could also determine when I self-reflected, a lot of my violent confrontations were with whites because I let my guard down. See, implicit bias worked two ways. I didn't see white people as a threat. And so my guard was down. When you interview suspects who've injured or killed law enforcement officers, that's the first thing they say they identified. Officers too, like they waited for that relaxing moment. So even from the law enforcement perspective, it's in their best interest to manage those implicit biases, because the data shows who are you most likely to get killed by. And so through simple things such as that nature, it's the only way we're gonna be able to mitigate this here. And like you're saying, putting that label, putting that tag. One thing you may want to challenge yourself or challenge your residents or your colleagues. You know, I like sometimes take and close my eyes and say, okay, imagine a person of color who's successful. Okay, imagine a person not of color who's successful. And to this very date, automatically, it's always more whites than blacks. Which was funny because just within my culture, I'm going to lean to the general more towards blacks as far as musicians, actors, and things of that nature, by the sheer nature of stuff I watch. But it's hard for me to identify. I can quickly identify with people who I've seen be given awards and things of that nature, or you see on TV a lot in certain spaces. So even though I'm teaching in this space, I'm doing research in this space, I'm still being conditioned by what I see on TV, what's exposed to me. And I'm making a lot of my unconscious decisions based off of that. And I challenge anybody, unless you're deep in, we don't do it during Black History Month because we put a lot of information out there. So catch it off month, and as a person of color, you know, and Dr. Sawani, I'm not for sure, I don't want to misidentify your ethnic group, but can you challenge yourself to do the same thing when you close your eyes and you think of successful people or impactful people? I don't know how long you've been in the States, or you're originally from the States. I'm not gonna make that assumption, but can you do the same and stuff? And if you're okay in that space, okay, let's try African Americans, and just put yourself in that challenge in different spaces. I do it with also females, and so when I find those gaps, then I try to educate myself to fill those gaps. And that's another way you can take and mitigate some of your biases, is educating yourself, and that's where phase 2, the knowledge part, come in.
Dr. Whitfield, speaking of the knowledge part, I have a question about whether or not you have any book recommendations.
I have a whole lot. You know, this what I'll maybe if I was at home, I got a whole shelf of them. I'll take in these books I choose. I read all, but it's certain ones I share because of the way I'm real big on how you deliver the information, right? It should be a conversation, not a I want to make you feel bad lecture and things of that nature. The truth itself should make you feel bad, right? Make you feel you want to do something and change and stuff. So I'll put that list together and get it to my wife, who can get it to Sharon, and she can share with everybody.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much.
And another quick thing too, I want to say, I know we're getting somewhat close to the end, is if you get a chance, go to YouTube, TED Talks, type in implicit bias. TED, that organization screens their people and vet them real well. What I like about it is it's very short clips. And you know what, Dr. Sinwani, this is nothing you want to do with your group stuff. And actually, if you can, try to make it happen before I get a chance to speak to them. I want to see the impact. Everything's research to me. Challenge them to watch 1 or 2 TED Talks as it relates to implicit bias a week.
Okay.
And then have that conversation with your group on the impact, and then watch the slow, subtle change. I'm all about getting information from different resources to broaden your cultural competency. And so a lot of people don't like to read. And so there's so much information on YouTube, but I only would suggest TED Talks. I know they do a lot of vetting, a lot of screening. So you're going to walk away with valuable information. But I will share that list with Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Dr. Whitfield. Will do.
Yes, sir.
Well, it looks like we have come up on our time so quickly. I have a couple comments here. Thank you. That was an amazing talk. Thank you all so much. If there are no other comments or questions, I think we have come to the end of our time. Dr. Whitfield, thank you again for such a valuable and insightful and educational conversation this evening. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate you.
And thank you all. And like in every opportunity and discussion such as this, I always walk away with information. So I've grabbed a couple of tidbits. I look forward to meeting with Dr. Sinwani and his crew. And I'm actually going to do some of his takeaways and also some of the things I've heard you talk about. So to me, that's why I like to call it a conversation, is exchange of ideas, perspectives, and so we can constantly grow. And how do we learn in science? Anything that remains stagnant eventually dies. So we're not always constantly trying to move forward and grow as individuals. We become stagnant, we die, whether mentally or emotionally. So thank you all also.